Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program that I hope you watch regularly that brings news, views, discussion, and up-to-date information on religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on the program is Greg Hamilton, president of the Northwest Religious Liberty Association. And I know what you want to talk about on this program. Your newest baby, right?
Well, it's
a book that you've put together.
It's actually my first published book in my life, so I'll just state it. But it's called Soul Liberty, Celebrating America's First Freedom. And it's all about America's constitutional founding and religious freedom, and how we got to religious freedom from the time of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower to the Puritans to the First Great Awakening and to the constitutional founding, and especially the Revolutionary War.
And it just hit me with your title. You want to say where you got the title from?
Yes. Soul Liberty is a statement based upon a little pamphlet that Roger Williams wrote, the founder of Rhode Island, and a Baptist itinerant preacher, and who had a charter from the king to establish the colony of Rhode Island. And what's interesting about Roger Williams is that soul liberty means the soul, meaning the conscience, and the liberty of conscience is really what soul liberty means, and that's how it's defined. And so when we think of liberty of conscience obviously is religious freedom in essence. And one could say, well, liberty of conscience is more than religious freedom. That's true, but and that's what Roger Williams meant it as. But one of the statements that Roger Williams made that we have to remember, and I'll just read it to you. There goes many a ship to sea, with many souls in one ship, whose weal and woe is a true picture of society. Sometimes Papists, Protestants, Jews, and Turks, meaning Muslims, may be embarked in one ship, upon which I affirm that all the liberty of conscience that ever I pleaded for turns upon this, that none be forced to come to the ship's prayers or worship, nor be restrained from their own particular prayers or worship, if they practice any. And that's key, because Roger Williams believed in religious freedom for all, and he especially believed in a separation of church and state, and where the state does not interfere with the religious conscience.
I believe he was the direct precursor to the founding fathers that actually put the Constitution together and formulated these principles. He's very close to my historical sensibility because he's linked inextricably with the Puritan ideas that led to the Civil War. And he himself was essentially the adopted son of Sir Edward Coke, the Chief Justice of England, who legally set in motion a lot of what led to the Puritan ascendants, and I believe led very much to the ideas that played out through the U.S. Constitution.
Exactly, and the wonderful thing about Roger Williams is he really believed that the church should remain separate from the state so that the church could be pure, or could at least attempt to have a pure society within itself. And that was interesting because, Roger Williams had sort of a communal sense of government, the way he looked at things, which is not the best. In fact, if you were to take Roger Williams to his ultimate extreme, you would call him a communist.
Well, you could say that about Acts, the book of Acts.
Yeah, I know. And he was true to his beliefs. He was true to the Bible, and not that the Bible is describing or promoting communism. Don't misunderstand me. But in a sense that Roger Williams believed...
Well, it's communitarianism.
Yes, communitarianism, but in a sense in which the community found its conscience directly answerable to God, and not to any church, and not to any state. And I think that's vitally important. With this book, I intended to make it available for legislators, for thought leaders all throughout the country, for people of faith, pastors, and so on, but also for children, because it's a coffee table book, excuse the term. A coffee table.
You're forewarned. I teased you before.
Yes.
As health reformers, we don't believe in coffee.
Well, whatever. I'm sure people will get over that. But anyway, it is in fact a coffee table book full of beautiful pictures on America's constitutional founding. And as one picture here, that's one of my favorites, it's up the Mayflower ship.
Very nice.
And it starts my essay, The Fight for Religious Freedom, America's Journey in Historical Context. But what I seek to do is restore the magisterial intent of the founders regarding religious freedom, and especially in regard to the separation of powers, the three branches of government. You know, when I think of the conceptual origins of the Constitution of the United States, it began actually around the fires of Valley Forge during the Revolutionary War against Britain, where George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall, who would later become Chief Justice and was the nephew of George Washington, sat around the fires actually constructing the future government if they were to win the Revolutionary War. And Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall came up with this separation of powers concept. That is, a fully independent executive branch, a fully independent congressional branch, and a fully independent judicial branch. And it was ingenious. I mean, here they were crafting the future government around the fires, cold nights where some soldiers were walking around with no shoes and bloody feet and gangrene and everything else under the sun.
It was
and you know,
not under the sun.
Yeah, well,
if there'd been more sun, there'd have been less problem.
Yes. But simultaneously, James Madison, who's dubbed the father of the Constitution, was crafting the same formula for America's post-Revolutionary War experiment in constitutional government. And one of the things that we forget about is, while the war was raging, another experiment was taking place in Virginia. Virginia's declaration Declaration of Rights was passed and adopted by Virginia's General Assembly, and it was James Madison who wrote in that declaration that all men are entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. And shortly thereafter, in 1777, Thomas Jefferson penned the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which was in response to another bill put forward by Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, you know, the person who got up and said, "Give me liberty or give me death."
He was not a libertarian. He had a very autocratic mindset.
And in fact, most people don't realize, you know, a lot of people love to celebrate Patrick Henry, but he opposed the Constitution, okay? And he actually, in the end, despite his being in favor of calling for a Bill of Rights, in the end, he couldn't bring himself around to vote for it.
Yeah.
Okay? He was just a naysayer all the way around. Probably a good guy, but as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote,
he was a rough diamond.
he had a silver tongue, but he didn't have too bright of a mind.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we have to remember that. But James Madison and Thomas Jefferson came up with Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in response to a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion put together by Patrick Henry. It was a government funding bill that favored the Anglican Church over all other religions. In other words, basically it was a bill that said, yeah, we believe that the Church of England should be disestablished from the Assembly of Virginia, from the state of Virginia, but at the same time, the predominant religion must be favored. And he thought he was putting forward a religious freedom bill. And James Madison and Thomas Jefferson came back with a Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom that says, no, this doesn't go far enough. We must have absolute religious freedom, which means a complete separation from the church and state. And James...
No, it was a landmark move, there's no question.
James Madison wrote in his 15-point memorial and remonstrance to try to influence all the religious minorities to come together to oppose Patrick Henry's bill, which was defeated in the end, and the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom passed. And by the way, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom became the foundation for the actual language for the First Amendment that we have today, especially the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment.
Yeah, it's clearly directly modeled after it, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Tell me something,
yes,
because I think for our viewers we need to settle it. Madison's memorial and remonstrance.
Yes.
I love what he wrote.
Yes.
But there's a continuing effort to characterize that as not written by him.
No. You're thinking of the
memorial.
No, not memorial and remonstrance. It's the memorandum. Madison's. It's called the memorandum. That's different from the memorial and remonstrance.
Yeah, I thought even on this.
It's the memorandum that's disputed, not the memorial and remonstrance.
Yeah. But we know his views. My point I want to bring out.
Yes.
You know, he was very consistent. It's not like something was discovered.
Yes.
That took another angle.
Right.
Madison was very plain on separation and the value of religion, but not the state not getting involved. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. Well, he wrote, he said, what influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. In other words, he was saying, hey, the experiments of governments where the state controls the church is bad. The experiments throughout the Dark Ages in which the church basically threatened excommunication of kings and emperors, where the church controlled the state, is bad. Okay? We seek to create a model government that does neither. Okay, and so they wanted to make sure, when they framed their government, they wanted to make sure that the state was completely free and the church was completely free. Mm-hmm. They wanted to create a win-win situation, and that's what they created with our constitutional system. Madison wrote in 1832, when challenged by a Reverend Jasper Adams. Adams pressed Madison with the argument that since most Americans were Christian, that Christianity in general should be constitutionally recognized and funded by the government in a non-discriminatory way. Mr. Madison responded by writing this. Here's what he said. He said, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions," don't we hear that today from a certain source out of the White House, may establish with the same...
Well, I wouldn't want to particularize it to the White House. This is a view that's gaining currency, and it's been expressed through this administration.
Yeah, let's send all Muslims somewhere, or let's all those religions we disagree with, or if you don't want, the other expression is sort of similar, well, if you don't like it, you know, move to Siberia. You know, you've heard that expression.
It's summarized under the term jingoism.
Yes, exactly. But he says, who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects or religious minorities, those they disagree with.
And that's reminding me of what, at the moment, I think an awful lot in the U.S. of what passes for discussion about religious liberty and legal developments. It's entitlement, religious entitlement for a particular religious viewpoint, not even a particular religion. It's a narrow subset.
Well, yeah, but when we talk about prayer in public schools, what are we talking about? We're really talking about Christian prayers in public schools.
And a certain type of Christian prayer.
Yes, exactly. So all others are excluded. And this, so are you? My question to people is: you're going to water down those prayers in such a way that all religions are included in it? How are you going to do that?
Well, the result is very often sort of namby-pamby prayers.
It becomes a non-religious statement.
Not plain who it's being addressed to.
Yes. And it becomes abominable to the Baptist, to the Adventist, to the Catholic, to all other religions to say, what kind of prayer is that? Right. We can't support that.
I know. To you and me it seems logical, but for different movements they get enamored with this entitlement issue.
Why would Christians be for government-sponsored prayer in public schools? It just blows my mind. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, muse on that while we take a break, and we'll be back shortly to continue the discussion with Greg Hamilton and this book that's focusing on the great Constitution. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, with guest Greg Hamilton, we were going hammer and tong on the argument, and now I'm going to stir things a little more. Great things that you're saying, and I don't question them. You and I believe that there was an intention to provide religious liberty, and there were good antecedents back to the Reformation, and even further for that matter. But we're filming this not far removed from Black History Month.
Yes.
Give me a good explanation of how they could have such high-flown statements about civil and religious liberty when there was a whole slave population. Not only were not civilly free, not always free even to practice religion.
Well, I would say that in context, they were living in the times they were living in, which means essentially that their consciences hadn't fully awakened to the problem. I mean, they knew it was a problem, but it was an accepted problem, okay? So much so that they compromised in terms of writing the Constitution as to what would allow the South, because it had very little population compared to the North, to allow for apportionment. So they said that African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person, which, going back to the Dred Scott decision of 1858, clearly was a statement that dehumanized black people as saying that they were anything but persons. And so that was a problem. Obviously, there was a practical reason for apportionment reasons so that they could have equal representation in Congress.
Well, I have a radical solution. Let's test it on you.
Yeah.
I believe the U.S. Constitution is a property document.
Well, sure it is.
And the amendments that
we have evidence from that in Revelation 13, where it calls the beast of Revelation 13, the lamb-like beast, he calls it the land beast, the beast that comes up out of the earth. And the United States would emerge. And why? Because citizenship and even the right to vote was based on whether you owned property or not.
Right.
Yes.
But the whole logic of it, you know, even life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The original statement was the pursuit of property.
Yes.
We all knew that.
Oh, yes.
Very well known.
Yes.
So the Constitution, it's a bit more than property,
yes.
but it's premised on a property concept
yes.
of rights and everything. So it exists. And the Bill of Rights that Madison had so much to do with, even though he didn't want a Bill of Rights, is a moral description of real rights. And in some ways, they are made to mesh together, but they're coming from two different points of the compass.
Well,
property and individual rights. And if pushed too far, which they were not willing to do at the time, like you say, because of the culture, they're contradictory.
Even though it wasn't the most ideal system, we still have to look at the ideals. The ideals.
That's what I tried to say in an earlier program. The constitutional ideals the U.S. adopted are a beacon to this day,
yes.
not just to the U.S. itself, but to the whole world.
I guess for me, even though I have a sense of pragmatism, I still say we need to keep getting back to the ideals, because I think it would help to heal our nation in many respects if we got back to our ideals. And for me, I think of James Madison, who wrote that experience will be an admitted umpire. In the papal system, government and religion are in a manner consolidated or joined, and that is found to be the worst of governments. So even in Madison's thinking, the reason why we wrote this Constitution was to get away from the medieval era in which kings usurped the authority of priests and churches and clergy, and in which the church usurped the authority of kings and emperors. And to get rid of that old system altogether and to have a representative system in which the people could choose the representatives and in which the separation of church and state was a reality.
It's interesting the way you expressed that, because I'm sure you know that in the Reformation, and particularly in England, the conflict that developed was between church courts and state courts, and they were overlapping. So it was a justice issue and a matter of who was in authority as much as a belief or shaking free of the church.
Well, it was an issue of jurisdiction, and it had everything to do with I don't know, I don't remember the term, the investiture. The power of investiture.
That's how it played out.
Who had the right to ordain who, and who had the right to interpret law, and so forth.
And remember, that continued. Napoleon crowns himself emperor.
It was known as the investiture controversy. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. One of the things that I want to point out in my book is the fact that in the Constitution, at least the way it was written, Jefferson said, you know, the Constitution should not be ratified until a Bill of Rights is attached to it. In other words, that 9 states should hold out and not allow for ratification, and to basically say we need a guarantee of a Bill of the People's Rights to be enumerated. And so a number of the states held out enough that forced the issue. And Alexander Hamilton came along and said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. They're already inherent in the Constitution itself. The Constitution
I thought Madison
enough.
was pushing that line.
Madison was too, along with Hamilton. But Madison, who was a close friend of Jefferson, began to see Jefferson's point in their fevered correspondence for a need for a Bill of the People's Rights. And so basically what they were trying to do was to protect the people from themselves. James Madison rose up in the First Congress of 1789 in New York City, right across the street from modern-day Wall Street in Federal Hall. He says, I confess that in a government modified like this of the United States, the greater danger lies rather in the abuse of the community than in the legislative body. The prescriptions in favor of liberty ought therefore to be leveled against that quarter where the greatest danger lies, namely that which possesses the highest prerogative of power. But this is not found in either the executive or legislative or judicial departments of government, but in the body of the people operating by the majority against the minority. In other words, they wanted to prevent mob rule, and so they felt that...
It's almost the secret principle that at this day most people don't understand.
Yes.
These guys were not pure Democrats or for pure democracy. They feared the majority. Most of the US system was set up to blunt the autocratic tendencies of the majority.
Yes.
And that's why it's a representative democracy.
But there's a counterbalance to that, and that is we the people, obviously the preamble to the Constitution represents a statement of that this is based, our country's based on majority rule,
well, I
but
think
with certain rights for minorities.
As I said during the Reformation, the issue that Luther had was one of authority. And the US is premised on the authority of the people as a body. They've vested that authority in their officers, the president and so on.
Yes.
And that's been forgotten.
It is.
I mean, in the last several administrations, the presidents speak autocratically.
Yes.
They don't have authority. They are granted oversight for a term but on the authority of the people.
Yes, that's right. Thomas Jefferson wrote, bear in mind the sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Yeah. And so that's the reason why we had a Bill of the People's Rights, otherwise known as the Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And so when we look at this experiment in which the founders sought to create a check and balance even on the people, even on we the people, the fickle will of the masses, so to speak, to make sure that the masses didn't do things that would actually wreck the Constitution. They actually wanted to preserve the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights actually helps to sustain the Constitution.
Well, you've just given a good rationale, which I know is the one, for why the American system seems very cumbersome. It was purposely made slow to respond.
Well, but my argument is that the Bill of Rights was intended to make sure that the Constitution did last. And I really believe that without the Bill of Rights, our Constitution would not have lasted as long as it has. That's my fundamental belief. Because you would have had tyranny. Think of the Civil War. Think of what was fought for there, all right? And a lot of people dismiss, oh, that wasn't fought over the freedom of the slaves. Nonsense. It was not only, to say that it was only fought over states' rights is nonsense. States' rights, okay, included the whole issue of slavery. And so slavery could not be divorced from that issue. And so without black people and women and minorities having access to the Bill of Rights, what did they have? And so here we have a system.
Well, what it meant was the Constitution didn't self-destruct when they moved away from what itself contained. I mean, the Constitution did contain the marginalization of the slave, but with the Bill of Rights, it moved to the aspirational side, so you don't need to get rid of it. You put an amendment.
When states were forced to abide by the Bill of Rights, then you see a system in which freedom was afforded to all at the lowest level, not just to a certain few. And so I really believe religious freedom, our constitutional system, is vitally important when understood rightly. I pray that this book will be a blessing to everyone who buys it. God bless. Thank you.
It's one of the great mysteries of history, at least to me, how in the establishing of the United States and the adopting and development of a new constitution, so many of the principles could be barely religious, deists is probably the best you can give to them. How many irreligious or unreligious or thoroughly secular people could come up with a document that at its heart defends freedom of religion, not just as a line item, but as a concept? I think that's the divine element in the history of the United States, how God could guide people hardly knowing what they were doing, but out of it came a protection that exists to this day of the ultimate right that we should all have to recognize God, to worship Him, to follow Him, to proclaim Him in the way that our conscience dictates. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.